I'm very happy that to announce that we have Carl May, Professor Carl May, speaking to us. I've learned, or I met Carl May. I don't know if you remember Carl, but it was in Norway, up north, really north and cold, and etc. But one thing really struck me there, and it was the point that you made in the key lecture there around overcoming the project phase, and that inspired me basically thinking about the temporarity of processes and the temporarity of projects in that sense. So I'm happy that you're here. And Carl, for who doesn't know, Carl is a medical sociologist and implementation scientist. And his work has been focusing on building a richer understanding of the factors that promote and inhibit the effective adoption, implementation, and integration of new technologies and practices. And that's all about working sociological perspective to implementation process, which I think is very interesting. Knowingly, Carl initiated and led loads of work on trying to understand and trying to come up with tools to understand those implementation processes, like the normalization process theory, which played an important role in this project as well. And Carl has been on the wagon, on the implemental wagon from the start already, even writing pieces of the bit that made this happen anyways. So thank you, Carl, that you're here. Carl is Professor of Medical Sociology at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And over to you, Carl. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Christian. Good morning, everybody. I'm so pleased to be part of this meeting. This has been a completely wonderful project. I've learned so much. I've met wonderful people, and like many British people, it has reinforced my very strong sense of being European. Okay, so I want to just demonstrate how bad I am at using all kinds of technologies for a start. One of the reasons I moved to the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine was because it's got such a fantastic logo, and I thought I'd put that up front and center in my presentation. This morning, what I'm going to talk about is actually what do normalization processes look like? And what I mean by that is, how do we get from A to B? You know, we've just heard about how difficult it is to translate innovations in healthcare into routine practice. And it does take a long time sometimes. Sometimes it happens very quickly. For many of us, we've seen really accelerated implementation in the time of COVID. But from my perspective, the question is, how can we better understand this? How can we make this into this process more easy to understand and more easy to deliver in practice? So I'm going to talk a bit about implementation science and implementation research, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my own theoretical work, which I've done with Tracy Finch and many others, Tim Rapley, who's also an important part of this study. And which has formed part of the theoretical basis of the work, as Christian just said. Now, and then I'm going to finish with a couple of remarks about the value of thinking theoretically about practical things. Okay, so I'm going to start by saying, well, implementation science has become a big thing quite quickly. When we look at it, it promises so much as a field of research. So here's the National Institutes of Health in the US defining implementation science, but it's a pretty standard, definition here. It's about the study of methods to promote the adoption and integration of evidence-based practices, interventions, and policies into routine healthcare and public health settings, and to improve our impact on population health. Well, this is a scientific discipline that is on the side of the angels, it must be said. We all want to improve healthcare. We want it to be better. We want it to be evidence-based. and we want it to do good. But implementation science is also a complicated field. I mean, I sort of see two major traditions of work developing over the past 20 years. One focuses on individual beliefs, intentions, and behaviors, and that draws mainly on social cognitive psychological theory. But it also draws increasingly on behavioral economics. The second tradition is anchored in quite a long history of work about the dynamics of collective action, the diffusion of innovations, and the behavior of complex social networks and groups. So there's some stuff here about what matters in implementation science. Is it individuals? Are we methodological individualists? Or is it groups? Are we old-fashioned sociologists? Well, I'm an old-fashioned sociologist. I put my hand up to this straight away. And what I'm interested in is how groups function. Now, implementation processes, which I'm interested in as a sociologist, and which I've been researching since, I guess, the late 1980s when I began my PhD. So these interests all predate the development of implementation science as a field. But these are not the same. These are not the same things. Implementation processes and implementation science are fundamentally different. Implementation science is about methods of translation. And like all scientific activities, it's disciplined, it's structured, and it's controlled. Implementation processes, which we see happening all around us, aren't like that. They're non-linear, they're dynamic, emergent, they're very complex. They're constantly interacting between people, objects, materials, technologies, organizations, populations. There's so much going on. And it's fascinating to watch that going on. It's very exciting sometimes. Now, let's have a think about the structures of research. So we have this very procedural translation of evidence into practice that you see in implementation science as a field. It's full of important scientific things. It's translational, so it's all about design. It's rigorous, so it's all about evaluation. It's cumulative as it crosses translational gaps. So it's full of ways of doing meta research, systematic reviews, clinical guidelines, and it's about making things different in practice. So we do things like diffusion, we do things like cost savings work, we look at profitability, and we also look at obsolescence and entropy and replacement, what in implementation science has come to be called de-implementation. And I guess for everything that is implemented, there is something that is de-implemented. Nature may abhor a vacuum, but healthcare systems abhor overcrowding of interventions. So that's kind of thinking about implementation. To my mind, studying implementation involves two distinct sets of activities and a problem. So we have to ask, how do users work with interventions? How do they understand or experience or enact the objects and behaviors and procedures that are being evaluated in trials like the ones that we've been looking at, or the intervention evaluations that we're going to look at today? And how do these evaluations work in their context? So how are processes through which interventions are organized and delivered shaped by their contexts? And as we're going to see as the conference goes on, all of this is organized around a big problem, which is how are interventions used as they are intended? How do those intentions change? And we need to think too about, well, what is a healthcare intervention in itself? we're talking all the time about complex interventions or this technology or that technology, and that makes us look at the things that people do, the things that people can use to undertake care. But these sorts of interventions are never just things in themselves. They involve changes in the way that people relate to each other or interact with each other. They involve changes in the rules and resources that structure action. And they involve changes in the taken for granted ways in which we contextualize the things that are going on around us, the way that we understand what's going on, and how those fit. And what we measure, of course, are the cumulative outcomes of those very different things. And we look at those as enacted practices. So later on, we'll be talking about results from process evaluations, where we're looking at how the practices of interventions are enacted in everyday worlds, and how those are interpreted by the people who are performing them, but also how we measure processes and outcomes around them. So returning for a moment to implementation science, we see that it's a fascinating field when we start thinking about methodologies of measurement. Right. So when we think about what implementation is, we can kind of say, well, it's the translation of the strategic intentions of one group of actors into the everyday practices of others. And its essence is collective action and collaborative work as people invest in continuous translational action and adaptive execution, and try to make their interventions become part of the routines of everyday life in the practice settings in which they're located. So there is a big process here that begins in one place. It begins in the plans and intentions of people who design healthcare systems, people who design healthcare interventions. But those plans are realized and made real by others in everyday practice. And that's where the action is. That's where the magic happens in implementation research. I never actually thought I would say that's where the magic happens in a conference plenary, but it is. That's where the magic happens. That's where the exciting work is. So let's have a think then about what implementation practices look like. And when we study implementation, we investigate work that people do. We are interested sometimes in their beliefs or intentions or their private thoughts, but actually pretty much everything that happens around an implementation process involves visible, purposive social action that is observable and measurable. And I talk about this in terms of adaptive execution and negotiations about capacity and capability. And I'm going to come to that in a minute, but always remember, when we investigate an implementation process, we are investigating work that people do in context around a set of objects and procedures, a set of interaction strategies, rules, resources, and organizing logics. So in normalization process theory, and I sort of counted up the authors of normalization process theory papers that have contributed to the development of this theory last night. And I've got to about 60 different people on 4 continents. So this is a big collaborative effort. We can start off by saying, well, we can understand some important things that happen in use at a micro level. We can say that interventions need interactional workability. They need to have skill set workability, and they need relational and contextual integration. They need confidence and trust, and they need resourcing. And at a micro level, we can look at interventions as they are in use using a framework like this. But I think there's some interesting work to be done in a very neglected area, the meso level. How does that collaborative work and collective action get undertaken? What are the mechanisms that drive it? And at the core of normalization process theory, as a practical tool to understand implementation processes, we have these 4 kinds of mechanisms at work: coherence, sense building, cognitive participation, how people become joined into and committed to things, collective action, about how effort is invested and organized, and reflexive monitoring, which is about how we appraise and understand what we're doing and how it fits in the world. And those shape and reshape the organizing structures and social norms and the group processes and conventions through which collaborative work is done. Those things interact with each other all the time. Think of implementation work as a set of feedback loops, not linear processes. They're things where things are interacting with people and people interacting with contexts all the time. And we also have a macro level question about how things work too. How are interventions enacted in context? And negotiation is so central to this that it's become the kind of focus of a lot of my work over the past few years. How do we negotiate interventions into use? How do we make space for them? How do we invent what British people call wiggle room, and which I believe in French is marge de manœuvre? You know, how do we create space for things to happen? And that's something that maybe we ought to think about more in implementation science research, about how those macro and meso and micro level interventions and processes interact with each other and how they work together to shape the whole. And I guess the really important thing here is always that implementation projects are messy. They're dynamic, they're complex, they're emergent. And they're what Jeffrey Braithwaite kind of characterizes as part of healthcare as a complex adaptive system. Everything is always more than the sum of its parts, and that creates real problems of measurement, process tracing. And Braithwaite, whose work is completely admirable, and for those of you who are not familiar with it, I absolutely recommend his papers to you. He says no other industries, talking about healthcare, has the equivalent range and depth, such intricate funding models, the multiple moving parts, and the complicated clients with diverse needs. Now, I suspect that Jeffrey Braithwaite has never tried to catch a train in England, where he will understand just how a complex adaptive system can be unadaptive and overly complex. But even so, this is a really important part of understanding what's going on when we're thinking about implementation. Implementation projects are full of unintended consequences and unanticipated outcomes. It's why they're so interesting to work in. It's why it's such a remarkable field. So we can start to think about components of these real-world implementation pathways. So we start, as I said earlier on, with the idea of strategic intentions that explain and justify the purposes of some intervention. But once we get past that, we're in the world of adaptive execution. People are modifying practices, finding workarounds, reshaping their worlds, changing plans, doing workability stuff. And as I've said, they're negotiating capability and context. We have experienced integration. They're reworking rules and resources, reworking relationships, and managing unintended consequences and unanticipated outcomes. And finally, we have this thing of continuing implementation and routinization in practice, or maybe not. So we have lots of things that go on here. And the point that I want to make is that implementation work never stops. It simply becomes less visible. All of us now live in a world where we have implemented Zoom or Teams or Skype or some other equally inhospitable way of video conferencing. We've had to change all of the ways in which we practice communications. We've had to change how we present data, how we explore the feelings and thoughts of others using these new technologies. And somehow we've kind of got into this, and we still have to work hard to make it work, just as we have to work hard to make driving a car work. Driving a car requires that everybody just carries on implementing the rules of the road. We just don't notice that we're doing it. It's kind of so completely normalized that we take it for granted. And this is kind of the point at which I always say that my interest in normalization processes began. I was interviewing an emergency department doctor in 2002, and he just installed a telemedicine service in his emergency room. And he was using it to communicate with another hospital and get advice and get expertise down the line in neuroscience. Now, he said to me, and this was a moment of real phenomenological insight, I think. He said, the thing about telemedicine, Carl, is it doesn't work. The name tells you that it doesn't work. If it worked, we would just call it medicine. And increasingly, we don't talk about telemedicine or telecare. We simply talk about or other patterns of healthcare delivery. E-health technologies are ubiquitous, they're common. Electronic health records are no longer special tools. They're simply part of the everyday apparatus that we have to struggle with in healthcare systems. Video conferencing is normal now that we have had to do it all the time, but we still have to work hard to make it work. We still have to work hard to make big video conferences a possibility. We just notice the work that we do less. So using theoretical approaches to understanding implementation processes has some practical purposes. It supports transferability and generalization. It helps us to understand what it is we're moving around. It provides a rational and empirically supported framework for action. Normalization process theory, like many others, has no kind of philosophical speculation. It's about phenomena that are observed. It's about things that we can see happen and that seem to be relatively generalizable in different ways. But good theory also offers strategies for successful implementation. And that's something we see a lot of in implemental. And it explains how and why interventions work. And that's something we will see a lot of over the next 2 days. And I hope that at the end of all of this conference and this project, what we will have and what we will show you are transferable and generalizable interventions that can shape practice. Around normalization process theory, which has been an important part of this study, we can use it to understand adaptive execution, negotiation, capacity, capability, but also underpinning all of that, the practices of self-organization that take place in complex adaptive systems like healthcare. We need to think as we do this about healthcare technologies in use, at work, and in context. And all the time, we must think about action. We must think about the things that people do when they try to make a healthcare intervention work. And just to close, implementation work is continuous. Innovations are organized around feedback loops in which agents, interventions, and contexts interact with each other all the time. Implementation work is continuous. It constantly happens. We talk a lot in implementation science now about sustainment as something, but sustainment is not a separate phenomenon. It is the continuation of implementation work, the continuation of the work of keeping something going and making it happen. And so just to end, when we understand implementation and processes, we need to look at how things are adaptively executed and how human agency and self-organizing mechanisms work as we go through this whole business of people working together to achieve admirable goals. For surely that's the purpose of implementation research in healthcare. It is to achieve admirable and important goals and to deliver things that do good. So thank you very much for listening to my thoughts this morning. I can see that there's quite a lot of you out there. I hope you've been able to follow what I'm saying. If you don't get a chance to ask a question and you want to, feel free to email me or to DM me on Twitter, and I'd be delighted to get back to you. Thank you all very much.
So thanks very much, Carl. And one of the things you highlighted there, which I find seemingly similar to you, very interesting, is indeed going from A to basically Z, and then again, so beyond. But apparently we shouldn't take the train in the UK. That's clear for that.
No, don't do that. Don't do that. Okay. You'll never get your destination.
So thanks very much for that. And what I also find fascinating in the sense, and I know it's much more complex and not so strict, but your view from starting from this sociological perspective of people working together, not so much as a mechanism, but rather and not so much as that things just happen, but really people on purpose do things. And I think that sociological perspective really enriches implementation science, and I've proved that to do that as well. So thanks very much for that. We will have a panel discussion later in the conference, for which I think we can dive very much more into depth of theories and your work and the relation to other things that are happening in research. But again, let me thank you very much also for all the insights throughout the project, and I hope to continue discussions on this important work for future. So thanks for that.
Absolutely.